All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions along the way. So here we have the lesson on World War II. We're going to be covering battles, events, people, war on the home front, the whole 9 yards. Here we have the flag raising on Iwo Jima, historical photograph taken on February 23rd, 1945 by Joe Rosenthal. It depicts 5 United States Marines and a United States Navy hospital corpsman raising the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. There is a chance you may see that again, if you know what I mean. So you want to pay attention to that image. The war in Europe, World War II began with Hitler's Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. The Nazis march into Poland on September 1st, 1939. Hitler and Mussolini form the Axis powers. As Mussolini says, the Germany and Italy will spin on the axis of Europe. The war in Europe, shortly after the Nazi invasion, Soviet Union will invade Poland from the east and the Baltic countries from the north in 1939 on September 17th. Here we have Soviet tanks rolling into Poland, and we've got the dividing line here on the map. This is the Soviet-controlled area of Poland, and this is the Nazi-controlled area of Poland. And as we already know, the Poles will be captured on both sides. Some will be executed. Others will be put into labor and concentration camps. Here we have a better map of the September 1st and September 17th invasion of Poland by the Nazis and the Soviets. During the first 2 years of the war, the United States officially stayed neutral as Germany overran France, most of Western Europe, and pounded Britain from the air, known as the Battle of Britain, which lasted from the late summer of 1940 all the way through the fall. Britain will stave off the attack and defeat the Nazis in the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force against the Nazi Luftwaffe. In mid-1941, Hitler violated the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Here we have a cartoon depicting Hitler breaking the Russo-German pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, and we see the Blitz, and it says, "Forgive me, comrade, but it seemed such a good opportunity." Remember, Hitler wants to gain vital supply in the Soviet Union, oil and wheat, but also Hitler has a hatred for the Soviets and communism. Here's a German photograph of a Heinkel 3 dropping bombs during the Battle of Britain. This is a Nazi bomber. And then we have the propaganda poster that the British used during the war and during the Battle of Britain. Keep calm and carry on. Sort of the British spirit of the tough upper lip during World War II. Despite strong isolationist sentiment, what does isolationism mean, folks?
Not getting involved.
Nice. Not getting involved, keeping our doors closed. Well done. The United States increasingly helped Britain. It gave Britain war supplies and old naval warships in return for military bases in Bermuda and the Caribbean. This is known as the Lend-Lease Act. We also brokered a destroyer deal, and Lend-Lease also. What other 2 countries did we talk about that benefited from Lend-Lease?
France.
Well, Britain, France,
Russia.
Russia, good job. There's one more.
Italy.
What country was invaded by Japan?
Uh,
Large, huge country.
Hawaii, no.
Huge. China, very good. All right.
I know this.
Good job, though. Soon after the United States Congress gave Franklin D. Roosevelt authority, Franklin D. Roosevelt compared Lend-Lease to lending a garden hose to a next-door neighbor whose White House is on fire. Remember, the Nye Committee, Gerald Nye, was against Lend-Lease. The opposition said it was like lending a neighbor a piece of what? Bubble gum. You don't want it after it's been chewed up. That was a joke. Thanks for laughing. All right. So we have the movement of tanks as a result of Lend-Lease, and then a Dr. Seuss cartoon. Remember, Dr. Seuss was a cartoonist during World War II. It's truly encouraging how much of this stuff drifts into British ports. Here we have Uncle Sam and the U.S. Lend-Lease Dunk Corporation, 2/3 of the way to England. How Asia became involved in World War II. What is happening here, folks? Pearl Harbor, very good. December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. During the 1930s, a militaristic Japan invaded and brutalized Manchuria and China as it sought military and economic domination over Asia. They also left what peacekeeping organization that the United States did not join after World War I? League of Nations, good job. The United States refused to recognize Japanese conquests in Asia and imposed an embargo or no trade on exports of oil and steel to Japan. Remember, that embargo wasn't like the valve was just turned off immediately. It slowly took place. Tensions rose, but both countries negotiated to avoid war. So here we have areas that Japan controlled in the 1930s and the Japanese marching into Manchuria in 1932. While negotiating with the United States and without any warning, Japan carried out an air attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The attack destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet and killed several thousand Americans. Notably, what ship on the right there was being sunk that the memorial sits over now? The USS. Nope, the Maine is from the Spanish-American War. Starts with an A. The last ratified state. Last ratified the last state to be ratified in the continental U.S. Another state with an A.
Alabama. Wait, you said an A? No. It's a state, right?
State.
Okay.
It was ratified in 1912. It's the last continental state up there to be ratified. Obviously, Hawaii and Alaska will be ratified after the state.
Not Alabama, right?
Nope, not Alabama. Not Alaska.
Arkansas?
Not Arkansas.
What is this?
Arizona.
Arizona.
Very good. Good job. Who said Arizona? I didn't. All right, USS Arizona. Roosevelt called it a day that would live in infamy as he asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Remember, thousands of American servicemen and civilians die in this surprise attack. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler honored a pact with Japan and declared war on the United States. The debates over isolationism in the United States were over. World War II was now truly a world war, and the United States was fully involved. This is an image on the left here of the Nazi-Japanese pact, and on the right, a piece of anti-Japanese propaganda. Stop him and the job is done. On the left, we have a U.S. infantryman with a Browning machine gun. Why is that vehicle and behind him important? What's important about the Jeep? But what type of vehicle?
What do you mean? It was a vehicle?
Yeah, the Jeep. It was the first four-wheel drive all-terrain vehicle. What does the Jeep do for us? Takes you off-road, right? Do we have a love affair now with off-roading? Sure do. So the Jeep becomes a major key piece of equipment during the war for American soldiers. This is a piece of propaganda from the OWI, the Office on War Information. It can happen here unless we keep them firing. That was the OWI's slogan or tagline. Couple of pieces, or let's look at 4 pieces of propaganda. He's watching you. That is the helmet of who? A Nazi. Very good. Later Darth Vader, somebody said. Good. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club. What do they want you to do here?
Buying car, somebody in the car.
They want you to save money, ration gasoline, ride with other people. Who are we looking at here?
Rosie the River.
Rosie the Riveter. Very good. Are you doing all you can? Now right there, they probably want you to buy war bonds, ration, plant a victory garden. Wartime strategies reflected the political and military goals of alliances, resources on hand, and the geographical extent of the conflict. Here we have FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Churchill on the left. Whoops. FDR and Stalin meeting at Yalta in February of 1945, just a couple months before FDR passes away. They're trying to determine how they're going to end the war in Europe. Allied strategies, Axis strategies, major battles, and theaters of war. The Axis strategy during World War II. Germany hoped to defeat the Soviet Union quickly and gain control of Soviet oil fields. Germany hoped to force Britain out of the war through a bombing campaign and submarine warfare before America's industrial and military strength could turn the tide. This campaign was called the Battle of Britain, which we previously mentioned in the late summer and through the fall of 1940. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the Philippines and Indonesia and planned to invade both Australia and Hawaii. Its leaders hoped that America would then accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, rather than conduct a bloody and costly war to reverse Japanese gains. Here the Germans battled the Soviets in Operation Barbarossa. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The Allied strategies during World War II. America and its allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, after being invaded by Germany in Operation Barbarossa, followed a defeat Hitler first strategy. Most American military resources were targeted for Europe. So we have a massive deployment to Europe and North Africa. In the Pacific, American military strategy called for an island hopping campaign, seizing islands closer and closer to Japan and using them as bases for air attacks on Japan, cutting off Japanese supply through submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. Like, for example, victory for U.S. Marines at Guadalcanal, and then the miracle at the Battle of Midway. Defeat Hitler first. Here we have Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was one of Hitler's right-hand men, control of the SS. Okay, remember, if we look at this map, Here are the key areas you need to know on the map. We've got the Battle of Britain in 1940 in Europe. We have El Alamein in 1942. We have Stalingrad, 1942-1943, the Siege of Stalingrad. We have D-Day, the Allied invasion, June 6, 1944, the Day of Days. And then we have the Fall of Berlin, May 1945. Not a lot that you really have to know on that map, so we got to dial that in. Okay, yeah, go for it. As for island hopping, we've got Pearl Harbor, Midway. We have to know Iwo Jima, Okinawa. We've got to know the Philippines. And we need to know the key cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not a lot to have to know for the island hopping campaign. But you can see the Allies, mainly American personnel, getting closer and closer in the Pacific theater of war. Minority contributions to Allied victory. Minority participation in World War II reflected social conditions in the United States. African Americans generally served in segregated military units and were assigned to non-combat roles, but demanded the right to serve in combat rather than support roles. So what do we mean segregated? Yeah, they weren't serving with white soldiers. They were separated. The Tuskegee Airmen, African Americans that served in Europe with distinction. We obviously learned quite a bit about them. Their fighter wing and their bombardier wing. Asian Americans, the Nisei regiments, meaning second generation. They earned a high number of military decorations. They are the most decorated military regiment in American military history. They have 21 Medals of Honor and a number of other individual and unit citations. This is a group of African American infantrymen drilling. Here we have an African American working in the shipyards. Here we have the Tuskegee Airmen. Here we have the 442nd Nisei Regiment. Contributions of minorities to the war effort. Communications of the Navajo were used, remember, in the Pacific. Oral, not written language, impossible for the Japanese to break. Mexican Americans also fought with distinction in the war, but their units were not segregated. Minority units suffered high casualties and won numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery and action. Do y'all remember what a unit citation was? That's like if everybody went into battle and we were successful, we would all win a distinction together. It's like a group award. All right, Navajo Code Talkers in the Pacific. Mexican American soldiers in the United States Army. All right, let's look at Europe. Stalingrad. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the months-long siege of the Russian city of Stalingrad from 1942 to 1943. This defeat prevented Germany from seizing the Soviet oil fields and turned the tide against Germany in the east. Remember, Stalingrad lie on the Volga, obviously an important waterway. The fighting was street to street, house to house, urban warfare. Here we have an aerial view of the devastation in Stalingrad. Here we have an image of the fighting from house to house. Europe, the Normandy landings on D-Day. American and Allied troops under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of our only 5-star generals, landed in German-occupied France on June 6, 1944. Despite intense German opposition and heavy American casualties, the landing succeeded and the liberation or freedom of Western Europe began from Hitler. And what we take a look at here, this is a Higgins boat about to drop soldiers off on the beaches. Remember, the hills were covered with Nazi machine gunners. Here are the beaches: Sword, Juno, Gold, American personnel at Omaha and Utah. Our airborne divisions dropped in the night of 101st, 82nd, and the 6th British Airborne Division. The Day of Days, the Normandy D-Day landing, largest amphibious water-to-land assault in military history. This is the beachhead after the D-Day landing. See how significant that image is. In the Pacific, Battle of Midway, also known as the Miracle of Midway, in June of 1942, just a few months after Pearl Harbor, American naval forces defeated a much larger Japanese force as it prepared to seize Midway Island. Coming only a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese victory at Midway would have enabled Japan to invade Hawaii. The American victory ended the Japanese threat to Hawaii and began a series of American victories in the island hopping campaign that carried the war closer and closer to Japan. Furthermore, how many Japanese carriers did we sink? Four carriers. Okay? Were they able to rebuild? Were the Japanese able to rebuild their carrier fleet? Nope, because they didn't have oil and steel. We also broke their code. What do we call that code? Color what? Color purple. Good job. All right. So we got Midway Island on the bottom left. Remember the dog fights that were taking place from this carrier-based battle. In the Pacific, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, 1945. The American invasions of the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa brought American forces closer than ever to Japan in the late winter through the summer of 1945. But both invasions cost thousands of American lives and even more Japanese lives as the Japanese soldiers fought fiercely over every square inch of island, and Japanese soldiers and civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. Here we have the flag raising on Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima, and American personnel walking on the beach of Okinawa after the invasion. So you can see how close America got. Here's Iwo Jima, Okinawa, mainland Japan. Here we have Churchill, Truman, and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, August of 1945, to work out the details of ending the war in the Pacific. The reason that FDR is not present is because he has died of a brain aneurysm or a cerebral hemorrhage, same thing I guess, in April of 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To prevent horrendous casualties among both Americans and Japanese of American forces had to invade Japan itself. President Harry S. Truman ordered the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force the Japanese to surrender. Tens of thousands of people were killed in both cities. Shortly after the bombs were used, the Japanese leaders surrendered, avoiding the need for American forces to invade mainland Japan. Note, the Manhattan Project created the atomic bomb. On August 6th, the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, 1945, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Here's the mushroom cloud created by the atomic bomb. This is Paul Tibbets the pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. Charles Sweeney and the boxcar crew will drop the second bomb. Here we have the two bombs. Whoops. Little Boy and Fat Man. In North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein, German forces threatened to seize Egypt and the Suez Canal, but were defeated by the British. This defeat prevented Hitler from gaining access to Middle Eastern oil fields and potentially attacking the Soviet Union from the south. Here we have El Alamein. This is where Bernard Montgomery, British commander, field marshal, defeats the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, the Nazi field marshal and commander of the Afrika Korps. This is the type of fighting that you saw, infantry and tank warfare. Here we have British tanks in formation in North Africa. The Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention, held in Geneva, Switzerland, attempted to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners of war by establishing rules to be followed by all nations in 1929. The conduct of war often reflects social and moral codes of a nation. The treatment of prisoners of war often reflected the savage nature of conflict and the cultural norms of the nation. Here we have the Geneva Accords on the left and a prisoner of war on the right. Questions? How the treatment of prisoners differed. In the Bataan Death March, American POWs, prisoners of war, suffered brutal treatment by the Japanese after the surrender of the Philippines. Japanese soldiers often committed suicide rather than surrender. We talked about the Battle of Saipan, where thousands of Japanese civilians surrendered. The treatment of prisoners in the Pacific Theater often reflected the savagery of the fighting there. The treatment of prisoners in Europe more closely followed the ideas of the Geneva Convention. There's a lot more eyes on and high-ranking commanders in Europe. What about the argument for Eurocentrism? What does that have anything to do with more humane treatment in Europe? Most soldiers were what color in Europe? White. It's Eurocentrism, the idea of that. So here we have the Bataan Death March on the left, a soldier about to be decapitated on the right. That obviously breaks the Geneva Accords. Yep, with samurai swords. Hatred and prejudice, the Holocaust. Here are Holocaust survivors of a concentration camp in Austria, May of 1945. We're just going to pump the brakes for a minute, and we'll continue shortly. All right, we got a few minutes, so we're going to move on here. Specific groups often were the object of hatred, prejudice, and faced an increased risk of discrimination during wartime. Note the 1935 Nuremberg laws set the Holocaust in motion. Guys, why are these folks having to wear this?
Oh, because they're Jews. They were classified with the Star of David.
Exactly, good job. These folks are Jewish. They had to wear the Star of David. What happens to their liberties and freedoms? Everything's taken away. Terms to know. Genocide, the systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious, or cultural group. Final solution, Germany's decision to exterminate all Jews, aka the pogrom. Check this out. This is a primary document from the New York Times. Berlin works out anti-Jewish rules. This is the Nuremberg laws. Is this making the front page of the New York Times? No. This is buried in the back pages. This is the Star of David that Jews would have worn. These are the tracts taking Jews to what famous concentration camp? Auschwitz. A final solution. This is what soldiers found, and they brought the German civilians in to see what the Nazis had done to their people, to the Jews and other victims of the Holocaust. Here are some of the leading extermination, concentration, and major camps controlled by the Nazis. The Holocaust and its victims: Jews, Poles, Slavs, Gypsies and undesirables, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and political dissidents. Here we have another image of Auschwitz, German concentration camp and death camp. What does that say on the... What does this say for any of my German students? Arbeit macht frei. What does that mean? Good job. With work comes freedom. Good job. There was no freedom.
I was like, you mean setup?
Short-term, long-term significance of the Holocaust. Shh. In the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders and others were convicted of war crimes. Here are the Nuremberg trials held in 1945, 1946. The Nuremberg trials emphasized the individual responsibility for actions during a war regardless of orders received. The trials led to an increased demand for a Jewish homeland in Israel. Here's the national flag for Israel. Please take note of this image, ladies and gents. The Nuremberg trials. And here we have Israel, which has ultimately created a lot of tension in the entire Middle East, directly resulting in our relationship and support of not only Israel, but also the U.S. relationship with other Middle Eastern nations. All right, we're going to take a break here. The war on the home front, women and minorities during World War II, VUS 12. All right, the war on the home front, women and minorities during World War II. Here we have Rosie the Riveter on the left. Piece of propaganda for the women in the war effort. Private Joe Lewis says, we're going to do our best, we're going to do our part, and we'll win because we're on God's side. Obviously, famous boxer from this era being used for World War II propaganda. World War II solidified the nation's role as a global power and ushered in social changes and established reform agendas that would preoccupy public discourse in the United States for the remainder of the 20th century. Women entered into previously male job roles as African Americans and others struggled to obtain desegregation of the armed forces and end discriminatory hiring practices. Note, this became the birth of the modern civil rights movement in America. Victory in war and victory at home. Excuse me. Here we have a piece of propaganda for the WOW during the war effort. Women's ordnance workers. Nationalism, success in World War II required the total commitment of the nation's resources on the home front. Public education and the mass media promoted nationalism. So here we have kids in public school during the World War II era and mass media through radio during World War II. Economic resources. The United States government and industry forged a close working relationship to allocate resources effectively. For example, everything was pretty much retooled for the war effort. Rationing was used to maintain a supply of essential products to the war effort. War bonds and income tax were used for financing the war. Business was retooled from peacetime to wartime production. Example, Ford car manufacturing turned into tank and plane manufacturing. Here we have that piece of propaganda. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, join a car sharing club. Then we have another piece of propaganda that plays on emotions and fear. Don't let that shadow touch them. That's a Nazi swastika. Buy war bonds, obviously to support the war effort. Here we have a gas ration book on the left, gas ration stamps on top here, and then a $200 war bond with President Roosevelt on the bottom. Human resources. More women and minorities entered the labor force as men entered the armed forces. Millions of men and women served during the war effort during World War II. Citizens volunteered in support of the war effort as well. Here we have a woman that would have served in the Women's Auxiliary. There were multiple auxiliaries for the Army, Air Corps, Marine Corps, and the Navy. Families were encouraged to plant victory gardens. Military resources, the draft or selective service was used to provide personnel for the Army. So people were drafted for the war effort. All right, contributions to a war effort came from all segments of society. Women entered into previously male job roles as African Americans and others struggled to obtain desegregation in the armed forces and end discriminatory hiring practices. Here we have women working in a bomb factory, and here we have an African American gentleman using a rivet gun to work on a piece of military equipment. Women during World War II, Rosie the Riveter represented women who increasingly participated in the workforce to replace men serving in the military. They typically participated in non-combat military roles. Here we have the original Rosie, the depiction presented by famous American artist Norman Rockwell in the Saturday Evening Post. And then this is the Rosie that was adopted by the OWI, the Office on War Information. It's a larger image of Rosie with her goggles, her campaign pens, her rivet gun, her lunchbox, and standing or sitting with her feet rested on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And then this is the iconic image of the American sailor kissing the American nurse when Americans found out that the war was over. VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. African Americans during World War II. African Americans migrated to cities in search of jobs in war plants. For example, Detroit, Michigan. They campaigned for victory in war and equality at home, the Double V campaign that was led by NAACP leader A. Philip Randolph. On the left, here we have a piece of propaganda, United we will win, and here's a civil rights march. Race discrimination breeds fascism. Treatment of Japanese Americans. Prejudice coupled with wartime fears can affect civil liberties of minorities. Here we can see that racism against the Japanese during this time. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Reasons for Japanese internment, 1942 to 1945. Strong anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast, and a false belief that Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy. Here we have Japanese children interned and other Japanese Americans interned during the war, And of course, they lost their property, their businesses, their civil rights, and their livelihood. Internment of Japanese Americans continued. Japanese Americans were relocated to internment camps, mostly on the West Coast. Internment affected Japanese American populations all along the West Coast. The Supreme Court upheld the government's right, Executive Order 9066, to act against Japanese Americans living on the West Coast of the United States. Note, the Executive Order 9066 was upheld in the Supreme Court case Kuramatsu versus the United States. A public apology was eventually issued by the United States during the Reagan administration, and financial retribution was made to survivors during the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations in the late 80s and through the 1990s. Here we have locations of the camps. Japanese Americans being processed at internment camps, and then this is an internment camp that just goes for miles. Media and communication assistance. During World War II, the media and entertainment industries saw their role as supporting the war effort by promoting nationalism. For example, the USO, the U.S. Service Organization, who entertained troops and provided support. You help someone you know when you give to the USO. Another piece of propaganda. The Office on War Information, the OWI, was established as the country's propaganda machine. Here we have Private Snafu to provide satire for soldiers during the war effort. Also, not only satire, but information, snafu. How the media and communications elements assisted the Allied efforts during World War II. The United States government maintained strict censorship of reporting the war. Also, letters from soldiers to loved ones was censored. Public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war effort. The entertainment industry produced movies, plays, and shows that boosted morale and patriotic support for the war effort, as well as portrayed the enemy in stereotypical ways. Censored, let's censor our conversation about the war. And that one was produced by the War Services Board. And here, quiet, loose talk can cost lives. Free movies, produced by the National War Finance Committee. And then that slogan of the OWI, let's catch him with his panzers down. We will if we keep him firing. A little play on words. Panzers, the Nazi tanks. This was a stereotypical way to portray Hitler. And then enemy ears are listening. Here we have Mussolini, Tojo, and Hitler. All right, please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.